Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
One August morning in 2008, a 25-year-old nurse from Portland, Oregon, went for a jog in a park and disappeared without a trace. A large-scale search yielded no results, and her case turned into one of the state's most mysterious cold cases. 8 years later, thousands of miles from home, on another continent, during a raid on a smuggler's warehouse in Ghana, an emaciated woman is found among the prisoners. It is her. This story is not about disappearance. It is a story about an impossible return and the shocking truth about what happened during those 8 years of silence. On August 14, 2008, Portland, Oregon woke up to a low fog that gave way to bright sunshine by 9 in the morning. For 25-year-old Gina Cruz, the day was supposed to be a rare break from her busy schedule. The nurse at Northwest Hills Medical Center was known among her colleagues for her impeccable discipline and meticulousness. In the intensive care unit where she worked, they knew that if Gina promised to be there at 7:00, she would be there 10 minutes before her shift started. It was this character trait that would later become the first alarm that set off a chain of events that would change her family's lives forever. At 8:40 in the morning, surveillance cameras on a private building near the entrance to the park captured a silver Honda sedan belonging to Gina. The car slowly turned onto the gravel road leading to the start of the Leif Erikson Drive Trail. This is one of the most popular trails in Forest Park, a vast green space that stretches for 5,000 acres along the city's western hills. Gina loved this place for the opportunity to be alone with nature without leaving the city. She parked the car in the shade of tall Douglas firs, checked the laces on her running shoes, and locked the door. This was the last action Gina Cruz took that can be reconstructed with absolute accuracy. She was scheduled to meet her older sister Amanda at 12:30 in the afternoon at the Rose City Roasters coffee shop in the city center. As the clock ticked past 12 o'clock, Amanda began to get nervous. She dialed her sister's number 3 times, but the call went straight to voicemail. This was an anomaly for Gina, who always kept her phone charged and was never late without warning. At 14 o'clock, Gina's husband Mark raised the alarm. He called his wife during his lunch break, but all he heard was a mechanical answering machine voice. Mark knew his wife's route. He knew that jogging usually takes about an hour and a half at most. At 17 o'clock, when Gina didn't return home to cook dinner as they had agreed, Mark, panicked, dialed the Portland Police Department. The first patrol car arrived at the parking lot off Leif Erikson Drive at 18:15. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows from the tree trunks. The police immediately spotted Gina's car. It was parked in the same spot where the camera had captured it in the morning. The car was locked. Through the glass, the officers saw a neatly folded change of clothes, a water bottle, and a woman's wallet on the passenger seat. The presence of a wallet with credit cards and cash virtually ruled out a robbery near the car. Gina went into the forest voluntarily and intended to return. A large-scale search operation began at dawn on August 15, 2008. The Portland Police Department mobilized all available resources. About 200 volunteers, divided into groups of 5, began combing the forest in a chain, moving from the main road deep into the thicket. 4 canine teams were involved in the operation. The dogs picked up the trail near the driver's door, led the search team about 1.5 miles along the trail, but then stopped at a fork in the road, where the soil was too dry and rocky to hold the scent. Forest Park is not just a city park. It is a dense forest with complex topography, deep ravines and streams. The dense crown of trees in some places completely blocks sunlight even at noon. On August 16, A helicopter equipped with a thermal imager joined the search. The pilots spent hours circling the search area, scanning every meter of land. But the dense foliage created a natural screen through which the sensors could not penetrate. The turning point came on the third day, August 17th. One of the volunteer groups working in the sector near Balch Creek reported a discovery. It was 200 meters from the main trail, in a place rarely visited by ordinary runners. On the slope of a steep ravine, among the ferns and blackberries, was a small silver object. It was an iPod Nano. Next to it, stuck between the roots of an old maple tree, was one running shoe of his left foot. The forensic experts who arrived at the scene recorded an important detail. The wired headphones were not just disconnected, they were roughly pulled out of the player's connector. The plug was bent and the wire was torn. This was evidence of a sudden, violent force. Either someone or something had pulled Gina sharply, or she had tried to escape, catching on branches as she fell or ran away. Police immediately cordoned off the Balch Creek area with yellow tape. Investigators literally sifted the soil within a 100-meter radius. Additional forces were brought in to check the Germantown Road area, where the person could theoretically have been taken if forced to leave the park by another route. But the forest was silent. No signs of a struggle on the ground, no traces of a dragged body, no scraps of clothing or bloodstains. Only a lone sneaker and a silent electronic device. The case was officially reclassified from a missing person to a kidnapping. Detectives interviewed everyone who had signed in at the park that morning, every driver whose car was caught on camera within a 2-mile radius. But the accounts were vague. Someone saw a woman in a tracksuit, someone heard the noise of an engine, but no one saw the moment of disappearance. The active phase of the search lasted 2 weeks, after which police resources were redistributed. The Cruz family was left alone with their tragedy. For them, time stopped at 8:40 in the morning on August 14. The Forest Park forest, majestic and indifferent, plunged back into silence, hiding the mystery of what had happened in the ravine by the creek. But among the thousands of trees and millions of leaves, there was one detail that the search team missed. A small, almost invisible thing, lying a little further away from where the player was found, pressed into the dirt by the tread of a tire that shouldn't have been there. Exactly 8 years have passed. To the world, Gina Cruz's name was just another line in the statistics of missing persons, a yellowed piece of paper on a bulletin board in the basement of the Portland Police Department. But 7,000 miles away from rainy Oregon, on the sweltering coast of the Gulf of Guinea, time was measured very differently. Here, in the port city of Takoradi, Republic of Ghana, on September 12, 2016, an operation began that was intended to stop the flow of smuggled weapons, but instead opened the door to hell. At 3:40 in the morning, a combined team of local police and Interpol agents surrounded an industrial facility on the outskirts of the port area. The Gold Coast Logistics Warehouse complex looked like an impregnable fortress, a 3-meter-high concrete fence topped with a spiral of live barbed wire and perimeter towers with searchlights. According to intelligence information, the warehouse was used as a transit point for illegal cargo heading inland. None of the raiders suspected that among the boxes of smuggled electronics and weapons, they would find live goods. The assault began at 4 in the morning. The explosion of a stun grenade broke the damp night silence, and the special forces stormed the premises. The guards, caught off guard, did not have time to resist. The sweep team methodically moved through the maze of shipping containers stacked in several tiers. The air inside the hangar was heavy, saturated with the smell of fuel oil, rotten wood, and rust. The beams of tactical flashlights snatched the markings on the sides of the iron boxes from the darkness. China, Panama, Liberia. In the far corner of the warehouse, hidden behind stacks of pallets of cocoa beans, stood an old 40-foot container. Unlike the others, it had no transportation markings, and its doors were locked with a massive padlock. What attracted the operative's attention the most was a strange sound, barely audible over the hum of the diesel generators running. A rhythmic, dull thudding from inside, as if someone was hitting a stone on metal with all their might. Officer Akwasi, who was leading the inspection team, ordered the lock to be cut with hydraulic shears. When the heavy, rusty door creaked open, the officers instinctively recoiled. An unbearable stench wafted from inside, a mixture of unwashed bodies, excrement, and disease. In the light of the flashlights that cut through the gloom of the iron prison, they saw 5 women. They were huddled together on dirty mattresses thrown on the metal floor. There were no windows in the room, only narrow ventilation holes under the ceiling, through which air barely leaked. The temperature inside, even at night, reached 30 degrees Celsius. The women were emaciated to the point of being skeletons covered in skin, their clothes turned to rags. They did not scream or cry. They just looked at the masked, armed men with empty, faded eyes, waiting for the next pain. But one of them reacted differently. The woman sitting closest to the exit suddenly raised her head. Her hair was tangled and almost completely gray, although her face retained the features of youth, distorted by deep wrinkles of suffering. Her arms bore numerous scars, burns, and cuts. She stared at the patch on one of the agent's body armor. There, in white letters on a black background, was the word "police" written in English. She tried to stand up, but her legs would not obey her. So she crawled across the dirt floor toward the light, holding out her trembling hands. Her throat made a hoarse, croaking sound that only turned into words on the 3rd try. It was not a local dialect. It was pure American English, not heard here for years. "Yeah, Gina," she whispered, grabbing the officer's pant leg. "My name is Gina Cruz. Portland, Oregon. Help me." The French-born Interpol agent froze. He knew the name. It was on the Yellow Notices database, the list of missing persons he reviewed before every international operation. But the woman in front of him looked 50 years old, even though the missing nurse was only 33. Military medics had to carry the women out on a stretcher. Gina Cruz was in a state of severe shock. She was taken to Takoradi Hospital under heavy security. The doctors who examined the patient were amazed at the degree of her exhaustion and the number of healed injuries on her body. But the main proof was waiting for them under a layer of dirt on her right leg. When the nurse carefully washed her ankle, a pattern appeared on the skin. It was a small, faded tattoo in the form of a Celtic knot intertwined with an iris flower. The exact same pattern was described in the police report on the disappearance of August 2008. Dental records faxed from the United States 6 hours later finally confirmed the impossible. The woman found in the container on the other side of the world was indeed Gina Cruz. Investigators were shocked. How did a person who disappeared during a morning jog in a park in the northwestern United States end up as a slave in West Africa? Gina was alive, but that life barely stirred within her. She flinched at every loud sound, refused to eat in front of witnesses, and constantly searched for a corner to hide in. Her mind seemed to still be in the darkness of that container. When the investigator entered the room to ask the first questions, Gina was curled up and looking at the wall. She did not respond to her name. Only when the detective quietly asked her if she remembered how she got here did her body tense like a string. She turned her head slowly, and her eyes were frozen with a horror deeper than the ocean that separated her from home. Her lips barely moved, uttering a single word that made no sense to the doctors, but made the Interpol agent go cold. She did not say the name of the kidnapper. She said, "The ship." And at that moment, outside the hospital window, in the port, the horn of a departing bulk carrier sounded long, and Gina began to scream. Friends, before we continue to unravel this tangle of darkness, I want to ask you for one important thing. Right now, click the subscribe button, like this video, and leave any comments below. It will only take you a few seconds, but it's critical for YouTube's algorithms. Your activity helps to promote this content so that Gina's story and the stories of thousands of other victims can be heard by as many people as possible. Thank you for staying engaged. On October 5, 2016, a special medical flight landed on a closed runway at Portland International Airport. Gina Cruz had returned home, but it was not a return to the world she had left 8 years earlier. The woman whose name had long been synonymous with hopelessness in police records was transported to a classified rehabilitation center guarded by federal marshals. Physically, she was safe, but her mind was still wandering through the labyrinths of the horror she had experienced. Detective Sarah Lance was assigned to work with the witness. She had a reputation for investigating crimes against the person involving severe psychological trauma. Lance knew that the usual interrogation procedure would not work here. No bright lights, mirrored glass, or cross-examination. The conversations took place in a semi-dark room with padded chairs where Gina could speak in whispers, often falling silent for long minutes. The minutes of these conversations, which stretched over 3 weeks, became a chronicle of the hell that began on a sunny August morning. According to Gina's testimony, recorded in a report dated October 12th, she was not alone on the trail that day. In the deserted part of the route, where the trees close in a dense arch, a man blocked her path. He did not look suspicious. He was wearing a standard uniform of a utility worker, an orange vest with reflective stripes, work pants, and a helmet. This image, so familiar to the urban environment, lulled her vigilance. The man, holding a clipboard, politely informed her that an old tree had fallen across the street, damaging a power line, and the passage was temporarily closed. He offered to show her a safe detour through a narrow technical path leading to the ravine. Gina believed him. She had taken only a few steps in the direction indicated when she heard a sharp crackle behind her, similar to a lightning bolt. The stun gun turned off her consciousness instantly. The last thing she remembered before falling into darkness was the smell of the damp earth she had fallen face first into. Gina's next memories were fragmentary, but no less terrifying. She woke up in complete darkness, in a cramped space where the air was heavy and metallic. Her hands and feet were tied with plastic ties. She felt the vibration of the road, heard the noise of wheels, which later changed to a frightening industrial rumble. Gina described a sound that haunted her nightmares for years. A loud metallic thud that shook her entire world, followed by a feeling of weightlessness as a giant port crane lifted her prison into the air. She was inside a shipping container. Weeks turned into an endless cycle of monotonous hum of ship engines and sea rocking. She survived only because once a day a small window was opened in the dark, through which a bottle of water and dry rations were thrown to her. It was the logistics of a living commodity, organized with cold-blooded precision. When the container was finally opened, the blinding African sun burned her eyes. She was handed over to a man the locals called the King. He was a European who ran a network of elite escorts for foreign mercenaries, merchant marines, and employees of private military companies based in the region. For 8 years, Gina was the property of the king, a toy for those who paid in hard currency and did not ask too many questions. But the most important detail that Sarah Lance managed to extract from the victim's damaged memory was a description of the kidnapper from the park. Gina did not see his face clearly at the moment of impact, but she remembered one detail when she came to for a moment while being transported in the van. The man was leaning over her to check her bonds. There was a drawing on his neck, on the left side, just below his ear. The ink was old, blue with age. It was a picture of a spider web with a small, barely visible spider in the center. Detective Lance stopped recording the interview. She went out into the corridor and leaned heavily against the wall, clutching her notebook. The spider web on her neck is not just an artistic tattoo. In the criminal world, it is a specific mark that often means a long prison sentence or belonging to certain prison gangs. This turned the phantom utility man from a faceless phantom into a very specific person who was probably already in the system. Lance pulled out her phone and dialed the number of the archives department, realizing that this small drawing could be the key to a door that had been locked for 8 years. But she didn't know that the search for the owner of this tattoo would lead them not just to a criminal, but to an old video that had been gathering dust in the archives of a completely different company all this time. On November 1st, 2016, rainy Portland greeted the detectives with a gloomy sky, which perfectly matched the mood in the police archive department. After the return of Gina Cruz and the first testimony about the man with the spider's web, the investigation, which had been dormant for 8 years, awoke with a new, fierce force. Now, it was not just a search for ghosts in the woods, but a hunt for a specific mechanism that was grinding people's fates. The investigative team realized that if the kidnapper used a cargo container, then there was logistics involved. Someone had to take the unconscious woman out of the park without attracting attention and deliver her to the port. Detectives focused on the blind spot of the investigation in 2008. Back then, everyone searched the forest, combed the trails, and interviewed joggers. But no one had scrutinized the other side of Forest Park, its western border, where centuries-old trees rest against the concrete and rust of the Guilds Lake Industrial Complex. It's a maze of warehouses, railroad tracks, and maintenance driveways bordering wilderness. It was here, according to the investigation, that the victim's transportation route could have been. Working with the CCTV archives was like looking for a needle in a haystack that had burned down 8 years earlier. Most private company records had long since been destroyed or overwritten. However, the detectives were lucky. The security service of the Riverfront Steel Metallurgical Warehouse, located on the very edge of the industrial zone, kept backups of its servers on physical media in the basement. After obtaining a warrant, technicians began reviewing hundreds of hours of grainy, black-and-white video. On November 5th, 2016, one of the analysts noticed movement on the monitor. The recording was dated August 14, 2008. The time code in the corner of the screen showed 9 o'clock, 20 minutes in the morning, exactly 40 minutes after Gina Cruz parked her car at the trailhead. A camera pointed at the back of the warehouse captured the edge of a technical gravel road used only for fire trucks and leading directly into the depths of the park. A white van appeared on the screen. It was an old workhorse, probably an early 90s Ford Econoline. The vehicle was moving unnaturally slowly, trying not to kick up dust. It was coming from the forest, from the area where civilian vehicles were strictly forbidden to enter. The license plates were not visible on the body. They were covered with mud, perhaps intentionally. The recording quality was terrible, with pixels blurring at any attempt to zoom in. The digital image processing specialists spent 48 hours applying the latest sharpening algorithms that didn't exist in 2008. They were able to extract details from several frames as the van drove by in the morning sun. On the rear bumper, on the right side, they could see the outline of a sticker. It was the logo, a stylized green wrench crossed with a tree and the inscription in a semicircle, Apex Mentoring Solutions. This was the first breakthrough. A check in the database of legal entities showed that Apex Maintenance's solutions did indeed exist in 2008. It was a small subcontractor firm that had won a tender to maintain sanitary zones and remove garbage from remote parts of Forest Park. This explained everything. Why Gina wasn't afraid of the man in uniform, why his vehicle had access to closed maintenance roads, and how the kidnapper was able to remove the body without being noticed. The maintenance van was the perfect camouflage. No one pays attention to the garbage men or electricians in the park. But the Apex company turned out to be a ghost. It was liquidated in 2009 after a scandal involving financial fraud and tax evasion. The office was closed, and the owners disappeared. However, the investigators realized that the van could not just disappear. It was carrying cargo. Detective Lance matched the time the van left the park with the Portland Seaport's work schedule. The distance from the Guilds Lake industrial area to the cargo terminals was less than 5 miles. The investigative team seized customs manifests and waybills for August 2008. They were looking for any shipments associated with one-day firms or suspicious shipments that day. In the list of shipments for August 14, 2008, the company Pacific Trade Link caught their eye. It was registered just a month before the events and ceased to exist a week after them. According to the documents, at 16 hours and 30 minutes on the same day, the company registered one sea container for export. The contents were listed as standard, used auto parts and scrap metal. Destination? The port of Tama, Ghana, with technical transshipment in the port of Algeciras, Spain. The detectives looked at the scanned copy of the bill of lading, and a chill ran down the spine of everyone in the office. The date, the time, the route, everything matched Gina's testimony. She was not a passenger. According to the documents, she was a pile of scrap metal. In the bottom corner of the waybill was a unique container identification number, TGHU 404892. Cell 404, Sarah Lance said quietly. This set of letters and numbers became a coffin for a living person for many weeks of sailing across the Atlantic. Now the police had the container number, the name of the shipping company, and the logo on the van's bumper. The chain was closed. The only thing left to do was to find the main link, the person who was driving that white van and whose signature was in the freight forwarder column of the cargo acceptance note. When the technical experts enlarged the fragment of the document with the signature, the illegible scribbled autograph seemed familiar to the detectives. They had already seen this name on the list of witnesses interviewed 8 years ago, but then released for lack of evidence. On December 10, 2016, the heavy steel gates of the Oregon State Prison in Salem slammed shut behind Detective Sarah Lance and Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Michael Thorne. This gloomy fortress, surrounded by 5-meter-high walls with watchtowers, had become a temporary home for more than 2,000 of the region's most dangerous criminals. But the officers were only interested in one of them, prisoner number 1493, who was serving a 15-year sentence for an armed robbery of a jewelry store and an assault on a police officer in 2012. His name was Caleb Reed. It took the investigative team almost a month of painstaking work with paper archives to identify Reed. The signature, K. Reed, on a Pacific TradeLink shipping manifest was the thread that led them to a file of administrative offenses from the 80s. Comparing the handwriting and checking the lists of employees of the liquidated company Apex Maintenances gave a 100% match. Caleb Reed was not just a driver. He was an official employee who had keys to the technical gates of the park. The most horrifying thing about this discovery was that the police had already had him in custody 8 years ago. A report from August 2008 preserved a brief summary of the interview of witness Caleb Reed. Back then, 2 days after Gina's disappearance, patrol officers stopped his white van at the exit of an industrial area to check his documents. Reed behaved calmly, even indifferently. He stated that he was replacing trash cans along tourist routes according to a schedule. The officers checked his body. It was empty and smelled like chlorine. No one wondered why the garbage truck smelled like sterile cleanliness, not waste. They let him go after writing down his personal details in a notebook. This mistake cost Gina Cruz 8 years of hell. The interrogation was conducted in an isolated, high-security unit. The meeting room was cramped, with metal furniture bolted to the floor and dim fluorescent lighting that buzzed like a disturbed beehive. When the guards brought Caleb Reed in, Detective Lance immediately noticed his neck. Gina described a spiderweb tattoo on the left side. What the investigators saw was a jumble of purple keloid scars. The skin looked as if someone had tried to burn it with a hot iron or laser it off in a homemade environment. Reed had tried to erase his past, but the outlines of the drawing were still visible through the scars, radial lines that spread out from the center where the ink spider had once sat. It was the exact branding the victim had seen in the moments before she lost consciousness. 42-year-old Reed looked older than his age. Deep wrinkles, pale prison skin, and a look of cold, predatory superiority. He sat down across from the detectives, rattling his shackles on the table, and leaned back with an expression of outright boredom. He knew the system. He knew that without direct evidence, any conversation is just a game of words. "You're wasting the taxpayers' time," Reed said without even saying hello. "I told your guys everything 8 years ago. I was taking out the trash. It was my job. If someone gets lost in the woods, it's not my problem." The FBI agent silently took a photo from the folder. It was not a picture of Gina. It was a high-quality image of a rusted shipping container with the number TGYU 404892, taken at the port of Takoradi. He placed the photo in front of the suspect without saying a word. Reed's reaction was instantaneous, though barely noticeable to the untrained eye. His pupils constricted, and the yellows in his cheekbones tensed. He stopped rocking in his chair and leaned forward, staring at the image. Confidence began to drain from him, giving way to animal wariness. He recognized the container. To him, it was not just a piece of iron, but evidence that should have been at the bottom of the ocean, or rotting in a landfill in Africa, not lying on his desk in Oregon. "I don't know what this is," he muttered, looking away. "I've never been to a port. I'm just a driver." "We know about the bills of lading, Caleb," Sarah Lance spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "We know that your van was the only vehicle on the technical road at 9:20 in the morning. And we have a witness. She's alive, Caleb. She's back, and she remembers the web around your neck." Reed sniffed, trying to put on a mask of indifference, but his hands gave him away as he began to nervously pick at the tabletop with his fingernail. His ego, inflated by years of impunity, didn't allow him to look cornered. He wanted to show that he was in control, that he was not just a garbage truck driver, but a player to be reckoned with. "She can't remember anything," he said abruptly, his voice full of anger. "Everything was done cleanly. I'm a professional."
"She remembers the electric shock," Lance pressed. "She remembers you tying her up."
"That's a lie," Reed said, losing his temper. "I didn't use the taser twice. That bitch in the park was kicking around in the van too much when she came to. She almost broke the window. I had to inject her with ketamine to shut her up. I injected her with a horse's dose, and she passed out before we even entered the port. She could not see anything. The room was dead silent. Only the air conditioner and the video recorder in the corner of the ceiling were working, recording every word." Reed froze, his mouth half open. He realized what he had just said. Information about the use of tranquilizers or injections had never been published in the press. In 2008, the investigation had no information at all about what happened to Gina after her disappearance. No one but the victim and her attacker knew about the injection in the van. Reed's eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out of the trap he had built for himself. He pushed away from the table, nearly knocking over a chair, and screamed, "I want a lawyer! This conversation is over! I will not say another word without my lawyer! You have no right!" The guards took him out of the room, but it didn't matter. The confession was recorded. The detectives had an executor. But when the door closed behind Reed, the FBI agent looked at Sarah Lance with a hard look. There was no triumph in his eyes. Reed was a brutal, primitive predator, but he was only a tool. The ketamine, the fake invoices, the international logistics. It took resources and intelligence that a garbage truck driver simply didn't have. Reed didn't just talk about the drug. The phrase "had to inject" meant that the syringe had been prepared in advance. Someone gave him the syringe. Someone gave him the route. And this someone was still in the shadows, directing a process that was much more complicated than the kidnapping of one woman. January 2017 brought cold clarity to the Gina Cruz investigation. If Caleb Reed was a tool, a brute force that ripped women from their lives, then the investigation needed the architect of the system. The answer came from an unexpected source: a cell in a federal prison where Reed's former petty theft accomplice was serving his sentence. In exchange for a reduced sentence, the informant told FBI agents a detail that Reed had once revealed in a drunken rage. "I'm just a hunter who brings the prey to the gate, and Arthur takes it out of the gate. Arthur has the keys to all the locks of the customs." The analysts spent 2 weeks screening thousands of Portland Seaport employees named Arthur, who worked there between 2007 and 2009. The elimination method left only one name: Arthur Voss. In 2008, he was a senior logistics manager at the international company Global Horizon Shipping. It was his signature that stood on the permits for expedited clearance of transit cargo. Voss had a security clearance level that allowed him to label certain containers as inspected, exempting them from scanning and physical inspection. On January 23, 2017, a combined FBI and Oregon State Police team pulled up to a neat 2-story house in the quiet suburb of Beaverton. The neighborhood looked like an example of the American dream: manicured lawns, children's swings in the backyards, peace and quiet. Arthur Voss, who was 55 years old at the time, lived the life of a respectable retiree. He grew roses and headed the local homeowners association. None of the neighbors could have imagined that this polite man with glasses had been the chief live commodity dispatcher on the West Coast for years. The assault took place at 6 o'clock in the morning. Voss did not resist. When the SWAT team kicked down the door, he was sitting in the kitchen in his bathrobe, slowly stirring his coffee, as if he had been waiting for this visit all his life. His eyes were empty and tired. But the main find was not in the living rooms, but underground. During a search of the basement, which had been converted into a home workshop, one of the agents noticed a discrepancy in the house's plan. The length of the interior wall was 2 feet less than the outer perimeter of the foundation. Behind the tool racks, perfectly sized, was a false panel. When it was dismantled, a narrow space was revealed where a fireproof safe stood. It took 40 minutes for the experts to pick the lock. There was no money or jewelry inside. There was only one thick, black, leather-bound accounting book and a stack of yellowed photographs held together with office rubber bands. It was a ledger, a detailed account of human lives sold as commodities. Detective Sarah Lance, wearing latex gloves, carefully opened the book. The pages were hand-drawn. Each line was a separate transaction. Dates, container numbers, weight, port of destination. It looked like a normal record of timber or parts exports, if not for one column called Specification. Lance flipped through the pages until she reached August 2008. Her finger stopped on an entry dated the 14th. The handwriting was neat and calligraphic, making the content even more terrifying. Container, TGHU 404892. Sender, Pacific Trade Link. Contents as per documents, auto parts. Actual cargo, female, 25 years old, Caucasian type, satisfactory condition. Status, shipped. Recipient, Black Star. A small photo taken by Polaroid was attached to the recording. It showed a bound Gina Cruz sitting against the gray metal wall of the container, her eyes closed, head down, and a fresh needle mark on her leg. This was a photo confirmation of the upload made by Reed for reporting to Voss. The investigators continued to study the ledger. The records began in 2004 and ended in 2012. Dozens of pages, hundreds of container numbers. The ports of destination kept changing: Hamburg, Marseille, Odessa, but most often it was West Africa. It was not just a gang. It was a conveyor belt. Arthur Voss remained silent during his arrest, but the book spoke for him. In the column Payment, opposite each entry, were amounts measured in tens of thousands of dollars. But the most important was the last column, which the detectives could not decipher at first. Opposite the entry for Gina was the abbreviation VD and the coordinates of an email on an encrypted server. When the FBI's cyber agents pierced this contact, they realized they had reached the top of the pyramid. The email address did not lead to a random intermediary, but to a man who controlled the shadowy life of the entire coast of Ghana. Another envelope was found in the safe, under the ledger. It contained a hard disk with correspondence between Voss and the customer. The last message, dated August 2008, contained only one phrase from the buyer: "Goods accepted. The king is satisfied." This digital trail led directly to the door of a nightclub in Takoradi, whose owner had no idea that his virtual anonymity had just been destroyed by a paper archive in the basement of an American suburb. February of 2017 was the month when the abstract evil hiding behind digital codes and fake names finally took on a physical form. After decrypting Arthur Voss's hard drive, the Federal Bureau of Investigation received the last piece of the puzzle. The email address of the customer led cyber experts to a server registered to a shell company in an offshore zone, but the traces of financial transactions that paid for the live cargo led to a specific point on the map: the city of Takoradi in Ghana. Interpol agents, together with local authorities, identified the person hiding behind the pseudonym The King. It was 50-year-old Victor Dragos,
an expatriate from Eastern Europe who arrived in Africa in the early 2000s. Officially, he was a successful businessman, the owner of the most popular nightclub on the coast, the Black Star Lounge. This place had a reputation as a place where you could get anything for a lot of money. Dragos lived in luxury, surrounded by security guards, and considered himself untouchable thanks to his corrupt connections in the local administration. But this time, the arrest warrant came from Washington, and it was impossible to ignore. The sting operation, codenamed Shattered Star, began at 3 a.m. on February 7, 2017. However, the surprise factor was partially lost. Dragos, who had informants in the port police, received a warning 15 minutes before the assault team arrived. When the special forces kicked down the gate of his villa, it was empty. Surveillance cameras captured a man with 2 bulky bags running toward a private dock in the backyard. The chase moved to the water. Dragos tried to escape in a powerful sports boat, heading toward the maritime border with Côte d'Ivoire. He hoped to disappear into the neighboring country, where he had new documents prepared. The Ghanaian Coast Guard sent up a patrol helicopter. The interception took place 12 miles offshore. Dragos's boat was stopped by warning fire from a machine gun. When the officers boarded the boat, the king did not resist. He sat at the stern, smoking a cigar and calmly looking at the muzzles of the guns, as if it were just an unfortunate misunderstanding that could be resolved with a check with many zeros. But the real horror awaited the investigators not on the boat, but in Dragos's mansion. During a thorough search of the house, they found a server room behind a massive bookcase in the study.
It was the digital brain of his empire. Dragos had a manic habit of documenting everything. The servers contained terabytes of video recordings dating back to 2005. Viewing these materials was a challenge even for hardened agents. The videos confirmed the worst guesses of the investigation. The women who were brought in the containers did not just disappear. They were held for years in the basement of the club and mansion, working at private parties for the elite foreign mercenaries, ship captains, and shady businessmen. In one of the videos, dated September 2008, investigators saw Gina. She looked disoriented, dressed in someone else's clothes, and tried to cover her face with her hands from the bright light of the camera. This was indisputable proof that Victor Dragos was not just a businessman, but a jailer. Meanwhile, in the United States, Gina Cruz was being prepared for an identification procedure. Detective Sarah Lance understood how traumatic this was for the victim, so the procedure was conducted remotely using photographs. Gina was shown a series of pictures, 6 men of similar age and type. When her eyes landed on photo number 3, her reaction was instantaneous. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands began to tremble, and her face turned pale. She didn't say a word, just pointed her finger at Victor Dragos's face and closed her eyes. The shadow that had been hanging over her for 8 years finally had a name. During Dragos's interrogations and analysis of his correspondence, a detail emerged that struck investigators as cynical. Caleb Reed, the Portland-based hijacker, and Victor Dragos, the Ghanaian customer, had never met each other in their lives. They had never spoken on the phone. Their partnership began back in 2007 on closed, anonymous forums on the darknet, a shadowy segment of the internet that was just emerging as a tool for global crime. They were strangers, separated by an ocean and social status. Reed was a failed driver looking for easy money, and Dragos was a sophisticated sociopath looking for a specific product. They found each other in the digital space, where Reed, under the nickname Hunter, offered his services, and Dragos, under the nickname Collector, placed an order. All logistics, from the choice of the victim to the container number, were discussed in encrypted chats.
Gina Cruz was the victim of a cold, faceless deal made by two ghosts who didn't even know each other's real names until the moment of arrest. The evidence was collected: video archives, financial documents, victim testimonies, and digital traces tied all the participants in the crime into a single knot. Extradition of Dragos to the United States was a matter of time. But when the plane carrying the prime suspect landed on American soil, investigators realized that the hard part was ahead. Dragos hired a team of the most expensive lawyers, ready to challenge every piece of evidence, and Caleb Reed, realizing that he was facing the death penalty, suddenly announced that he had information about other victims whose bodies were still lying in the forests of Oregon, and he was ready to show the grave sites, but only on one condition. August of 2017 became the month of retribution for which the Cruz family had been waiting for 9 long years. Silence reigned in the courtroom of the Federal Court of Oregon in Portland, broken only by the rustling of papers on the judge's desk and the muffled clicks of the cameras of accredited journalists. The trial, which had spanned 2 countries and 3 different jurisdictions, was approaching its logical conclusion. People who had turned human life into a commodity were in the dock, but each of them met justice in a different way. Caleb Reed was the first to hear the verdict. The former garbage truck driver's lawyers made an unprecedented deal with the investigation. Realizing that the totality of the evidence, from the DNA on the headphones to Gina's testimony, would guarantee him the death penalty, Reed offered a plea bargain. In exchange for his life, he agreed to reveal the grave sites of other victims that the police did not even know about. His testimony led the search team to a remote patch of woods near Highway 6 in the Tillamook Massif. There, under a layer of pine needles and earth, they found the remains of an 18-year-old student who was believed to be a runaway from 2010. Reed also confessed to the kidnapping of another woman, whom he sold to the same network, but who died during transportation. Given the gravity of the crimes and the cold calculation, the judge was adamant in his decision, despite the plea deal. Caleb Reed was sentenced to life without parole. He was sent to Snake River Maximum Security Prison, where he will spend the rest of his days in solitary confinement. Arthur Voss was next. The former logistics manager, who for years sat in his clean office and signed death warrants with a single stroke of his pen, looked broken and aged in court. His line of defense, based on the claim of ignorance of the contents of the containers, fell apart after the demonstration of the ledger and correspondence with Dragos. A federal judge called his actions evil bureaucracy. Voss was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. For a 56-year-old man, this actually meant a life sentence. The most notorious was the trial of Victor Dragos. After a complicated extradition procedure from Ghana, the king was brought before the American justice system. Unlike his accomplices, Dragos behaved defiantly, refusing to recognize the jurisdiction of the U.S. court and claiming to be the victim of a political conspiracy. However, the testimony of Gina and 4 other rescued women, who testified via video link, left no doubt in the jury's mind. Victor Dragos was found guilty on all charges, including human trafficking, forced detention, and organization of a criminal group. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, plus 120 years in prison. When the gavel fell for the last time, the media hype around the case began to subside. The journalists left, the cameras were turned off, and the public switched to new sensations. But for Gina Cruz, the real ending of this story took place not in a courtroom, but hundreds of miles away from Portland. Gina couldn't stay in the city where every park and every shadow reminded her of what she had experienced. She moved in with her parents in the town of Bend, located in the high desert region of Central Oregon. The landscape here was radically different. Open spaces, low shrubs, huge skies, and most importantly, no dense, dark forests to block the sun. Here she could see the horizon for miles around. Her rehabilitation was slow and painful. Gina worked with a psychotherapist 3 times a week, learned to trust people again, and fought claustrophobic attacks. She could not enter elevators, would not close the door to her room even at night, and would flinch at the sound of passing trucks. But with each passing month, the darkness receded. On August 20th, 2017, the 9th anniversary of her rescue, as she now called the day she was lost to the old world, Gina did something she had avoided for almost a decade. She took a new pair of running shoes out of the box. They weren't the same sneakers that had been left in the mud of Forest Park, but the process of lacing them up made her hands shake. She sat on the edge of the bed for about 20 minutes, staring at her feet. Her body's memory screamed danger, bringing her back to the moment of the stun gun. But this time, Gina didn't let her fear win. She took a deep breath of the dry desert air, tightened her shoe, and stood up. She walked out onto the porch of her parents' house. An asphalt path stretched out in front of her, bathed in the evening sun. There were no trees around, just open space and the distant peaks of the Cascade Mountains on the horizon. Gina took the first step, then the second. Her feet touched the hard surface. She did not run into the forest. She was not trying to set a speed record. She just walked with a steady, confident step down the street, feeling like she was regaining control of her life, which had been stolen from her 9 years ago with every meter. She walked toward the sun, leaving the shadows of the past where they belonged, behind her, in the closed files of the police archives. The story of Gina Cruz's disappearance is over. The story of her life has begun.